On January 17, 1991, the Gulf War erupted, becoming one of the defining moments of modern military history. This war was not just a testament to the advancements in military technology, but also a key event that reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East. As one of the most significant international conflicts of the late 20th century, the Gulf War was fought between a U.S.-led coalition and Iraq under Saddam Hussein's regime. The conflict captured global attention due to its scale, technological sophistication, and global implications. But how did this war begin? Why did it become such a critical focal point in international affairs? And what lasting impact did it have on the Middle East and the world? In this detailed account, we will explore every pivotal moment of this conflict, from the underlying causes to the aftermath that continued to shape global politics. The Gulf War's origins can be traced back to long-standing historical disputes between Iraq and Kuwait, coupled with the ambitions of Saddam Hussein, Iraq's leader at the time. Following the devastating 8-year Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, Iraq's economy was in shambles. The war had depleted the country's resources, and Saddam was desperate for a solution to Iraq's mounting economic crisis. In his quest to stabilize Iraq, Saddam turned his attention to Kuwait, a wealthy neighboring country with vast oil reserves. The Iran-Iraq War left Iraq in a dire economic situation. This prolonged conflict, centered on territorial disputes and the struggle for regional dominance, strained Iraq's finances to the breaking point. Throughout the war, Iraq relied heavily on financial aid from Western nations and Arab allies, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. However, by the end of the war, Iraq was heavily in debt, with its infrastructure in ruins. The war also deepened Iraq's isolation on the international stage. Although Saddam had received support from some Western nations during the conflict, Iraq found itself increasingly marginalized in the post-war period. Internally, the Iraqi government faced mounting political unrest and social instability, with opposition movements from the Shiite and Kurdish populations growing stronger. The nation was on the brink of economic collapse, and Saddam's grip on power was becoming more precarious. Kuwait, though small in size, was one of the richest nations in the world, thanks to its vast oil reserves. The country controlled about 10% of the world's oil supply, making it a key player in global energy markets. In contrast to Iraq, Kuwait's economy was flourishing, and its wealth outstripped that of many larger nations. However, relations between Iraq and Kuwait had long been strained. Iraq had accused Kuwait of engaging in slant drilling into the Rumaila oil field, effectively siphoning oil from Iraqi reserves. Saddam's government demanded compensation, accusing Kuwait of stealing Iraq's oil and undermining its economic recovery. Saddam also called for Kuwait to raise oil prices, arguing that low oil prices were exacerbating Iraq's financial problems. Additionally, Saddam claimed that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq, pointing to British colonial-era divisions as the cause of the two nations' border disputes. This historical claim, combined with Iraq's economic desperation, provided Saddam with a justification to invade Kuwait. Saddam Hussein was not only frustrated by Kuwait's oil policies, but also by the loans Kuwait and Saudi Arabia had provided Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq had borrowed billions of dollars from both nations, and Saddam demanded that these debts be forgiven, claiming that Iraq had protected the Arab world from Iranian aggression. When Kuwait refused to forgive the debt and continued to maintain low oil prices, Saddam saw this as a deliberate effort to weaken Iraq's economy. Tensions between Iraq and Kuwait reached a boiling point in the summer of 1990. Saddam decided to take drastic action. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait in a large-scale military operation. Within hours, over 100,000 Iraqi troops had overwhelmed Kuwait's defenses and occupied the country. The Kuwaiti military, vastly outgunned and outnumbered, was no match for Iraq's well-equipped forces. The Kuwaiti royal family fled into exile, and Saddam quickly annexed Kuwait, declaring it as Iraq's 19th province. The invasion sent shockwaves around the world. Kuwait's vast oil reserves and its strategic position in the Gulf made the invasion a global concern. Saddam's actions not only destabilized the region, but also threatened the global economy, particularly the oil markets. In the wake of Iraq's occupation of Kuwait, global oil prices surged, sparking economic uncertainty. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait immediately triggered a strong international response. The United Nations Security Council swiftly condemned Iraq's actions, passing a series of resolutions demanding Iraq's immediate withdrawal. These resolutions also included the freezing of Iraqi assets and the imposition of severe economic sanctions. However, despite mounting international pressure, Saddam remained defiant, refusing to withdraw from Kuwait. The invasion of Kuwait marked one of the most significant moments of international unity since the end of the Cold War. The UN Security Council moved quickly to pass Resolution 660, demanding that Iraq withdraw its forces from Kuwait unconditionally. This was followed by several other resolutions, including Resolution 661, which imposed a complete trade embargo on Iraq, and Resolution 678, which authorized the use of force if Iraq did not comply with the UN's demands by January 15, 1991. The economic sanctions imposed on Iraq were among the harshest in history. They included a ban on the sale of arms to Iraq, the freezing of Iraqi financial assets, and a halt to Iraq's oil exports. These sanctions were designed to cripple Iraq's economy and force Saddam to reconsider his occupation of Kuwait. However, instead of backing down, Saddam doubled down on his claims that Kuwait was rightfully Iraqi territory and dared any nation to challenge him militarily. The United States played a central role in orchestrating the international response to Iraq's invasion. President George H.W. Bush quickly took a firm stand against Saddam's aggression, viewing the invasion as a direct threat to regional stability and global security. The Bush administration was particularly concerned about the security of Saudi Arabia, a key U.S. ally and the world's largest oil producer. If Saddam were to extend his control into Saudi Arabia, he would effectively dominate the global oil supply. In a televised address, President Bush declared that Iraq's invasion would not stand, and warned that the world would not tolerate such blatant violations of international law. The U.S. began to build a broad international coalition, working closely with the United Nations and regional powers to coordinate sanctions against Iraq and prepare for a possible military intervention. Saudi Arabia, with its vast oil reserves and proximity to Iraq, was a central focus of the U.S. military strategy. The Saudi royal family, alarmed by the invasion of Kuwait, feared that Saddam might target Saudi Arabia next. With Iraqi forces positioned near the Saudi border, the threat to the kingdom's oil-rich eastern province loomed large. In response, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia agreed to allow U.S. and coalition forces to deploy in Saudi Arabia to defend the kingdom from a potential Iraqi invasion. This deployment, known as Operation Desert Shield, marked the beginning of a massive military buildup in the Gulf region. By late 1990, hundreds of thousands of troops from more than 30 nations had arrived in Saudi Arabia, ready to confront Iraq if diplomacy failed. On January 17, 1991, the coalition forces launched Operation Desert Storm, initiating a massive air campaign against Iraq. The goal was to degrade Iraq's military capabilities by targeting its air defenses, communication networks, and critical infrastructure. Thousands of coalition aircraft, including bombers, fighter jets, and cruise missiles, struck key Iraqi targets across the country. The air campaign was a demonstration of modern military technology at its finest. Coalition forces utilized precision-guided munitions, including Tomahawk cruise missiles and F-117 stealth bombers, to destroy Iraqi targets with unprecedented accuracy. Within days, Iraq's air defense network was effectively neutralized, and Saddam's ability to coordinate his military forces was severely diminished. In a bid to break the coalition and widen the conflict, Saddam ordered the launch of Scud missiles against Israel, hoping to provoke an Israeli military response. By drawing Israel into the war, Saddam aimed to fracture the coalition, particularly the Arab states that had joined the US-led alliance. However, this strategy backfired. Despite being targeted by Scud missiles, Israel refrained from retaliating, largely due to pressure from the United States. The U.S. deployed Patriot missile batteries to Israel and Saudi Arabia, intercepting many of the Scud missiles and minimizing their damage. Saddam's attempt to disrupt the coalition failed, and the war continued to progress in favor of the coalition forces. On February 24, 1991, after weeks of relentless airstrikes, the coalition launched its ground offensive, known as Operation Desert Sabre. The ground campaign was swift and decisive. Coalition forces, led by U.S. and British troops, advanced rapidly through Kuwait and southern Iraq, encountering little resistance from the demoralized Iraqi military. The coalition's armored divisions, equipped with M1 Abrams tanks, easily outmatched Iraq's aging T-72 tanks. Within days, coalition forces had broken through Iraq's defenses and liberated Kuwait City. Iraqi troops, overwhelmed by the superior firepower and technology of the coalition, began to surrender en masse. As Iraqi forces retreated, Saddam ordered the destruction of Kuwait's oil infrastructure in a scorched earth campaign. Iraqi troops set fire to hundreds of oil wells, creating one of the worst environmental disasters in history. Towering plumes of black smoke filled the skies, and millions of barrels of oil were spilled into the Persian Gulf. The environmental and economic damage caused by the fires was catastrophic. Kuwait's oil industry was devastated, and the region's ecosystems were severely affected. The fires burned for months, and it took an international effort to finally extinguish them. On February 28, 1991, President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire, bringing an end to the Gulf War. The coalition had achieved its primary objective, the liberation of Kuwait. However, despite the overwhelming military defeat, Saddam Hussein remained in power in Iraq. The decision not to pursue Iraqi forces into Baghdad and remove Saddam from power would later be a source of controversy. In the wake of the war, the United Nations imposed even harsher sanctions on Iraq. These sanctions included strict limits on Iraq's oil exports and a continued arms embargo. The goal was to weaken Saddam's regime and prevent Iraq from rebuilding its military capabilities. While the sanctions succeeded in crippling Iraq's economy, they also caused widespread suffering among the Iraqi civilian population. Food shortages, a lack of medical supplies, and deteriorating infrastructure led to a humanitarian crisis. The Gulf War had far-reaching implications for the Middle East and the world. It showcased the effectiveness of modern military technology, particularly in terms of air power and precision-guided weapons. It also demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in addressing regional conflicts, with the coalition serving as a model for future military interventions. However, the war did not bring lasting peace to the region. Saddam Hussein's continued rule in Iraq ensured that tensions in the Middle East remained high. The sanctions imposed on Iraq fueled resentment and instability, setting the stage for the Iraq War in 2003, which would again reshape the region. The Gulf War was a pivotal moment in modern history, combining advanced military technology, international diplomacy, and complex geopolitics. It highlighted the power of a united international community, but also underscored the limits of military intervention in securing long-term peace. While the coalition's victory in Kuwait was decisive, the war left unresolved tensions that would continue to affect the Middle East for years to come.